things that weren't applied agriculture, but look at basic genetic questions. And one of the questions that I began to ask was, does the mutation selection process work? Does the Darwinian mechanism deliver? Now, definitely selection happens. Mutations happen and selection happens. The question is, do those two things together explain the origin of life, and can they explain how a bacteria could turn into a human being? And so when I was in college, I was certain, I knew for sure, that mutation selection explained life and explained us, explained everything. And so as a graduate student, I met a really inspiring young fellow student who had what I would call a romantic evolutionist. Before that, I was just a hardcore evolutionist. And he said, well, it's very exciting because evolution's going somewhere. It's actually taking us to higher and higher places. And that's really exciting. It's slightly mystical because, you know, it's saying that there's direction to evolution, whereas most biologists would say, no, evolution is completely without direction. And as I matured, I started to discover things about myself, for example, that I'm a sinful person, and that my marriage wasn't going to last just based upon our faithfulness to each other. And I actually found myself in a church, and I actually encountered God, and God changed me. That's, you know, one of the really strong evidences that Jesus Christ is who he claims he is that he has the ability to change lives. And I believe that's the best evidence, because if you just go around and ask people, you'll find there are a lot of Christians out there, and if you ask them why, a large number will say, because he changed my life profoundly. He turned my life upside down. And so I believe that that type of evidence outweighs what I'm going to be presenting today. But what I'm presenting today is important. You know, the influenza virus has killed hundreds of millions of people just since 1918. And AIDS is killing tens, maybe 100 million people now. But I believe the most destructive thing that happened in the last several hundred years was the Darwinian theory, because I believe it has led to the destruction of billions of people. Not just destruction of their body, but their soul. So this is actually a really big thing. It seems like just an academic concern. Hey, Jeremy? But the thing is, what we call neo-Darwinian theory is like a universal acid. It destroys everything of value. And the person who came up with the universal acid idea was a hardcore atheist. He's saying, yeah, this dissolves morality, this dissolves all religion, this dissolves purpose of life. And so what neo-Darwinian theory means is taking Darwin's idea and updating it. That's all it is an updated version of Darwinian theory. And that's what we're going to be talking about today. And I would like to suggest to you that the neo-Darwinian theory is the most powerful concept that has ever impacted the university environment. This concept now directs how people think about sociology, archaeology, psychology, biology, astronomy. Every field you can think of is now directed by this paradigm. And so what's interesting is this paradigm, which has become so strong, is actually coming apart. The paradigm is collapsing. In the face of modern genetic evidence, the paradigm cannot stand. And so that's a bold thing for me to say, but I think I'm going to be able to convince many or all of you of that. So in the big picture now, if you're an atheist, like I was for much of my life, you believe in 4 naturalistic miracles. See, an atheist needs to believe that everything happened spontaneously. Nothing happened by design or by purpose. And so you have to believe in a spontaneous universe. You know, in the beginning there was nothing, and then there was a fluctuation in the nothingness, and then everything appeared. That's really a long, if you examine that, it's taught as a fact across this university. It's a fact. We all know the Big Bang is true. The interesting thing is, actually, you can't defend it. It's indefensible. They go way beyond science to tell a very tall tale. And so the people who believe in Big Bang, that's fine if you want to believe in it, but you need to understand you're believing it by faith. It's not a testable hypothesis. There's no experiment you can do that will validate that. Similarly with spontaneous life. If you ask biologists on this, all the biologists on this campus, I believe that all of them would say, be honest enough to say, well, we know that life arose through chemistry. Chemicals came together and formed the first living cell. But we don't know how. And we're going to be honest enough to admit we hold that view by faith. See, if you say you know something's true, but you can't explain why or give evidence for it, that's a faith-held position. Now, I respect faith-held positions because my most fundamental beliefs are based upon faith. I decided to trust Jesus. And so I have faith in him. But everybody has faith in something. Even the skeptics, even the committed atheists have faith. If you believe that once the first bacterium arose spontaneously, that now mutation and selection will spontaneously, through natural process, turn that bacterium into a human being, that's fine, but that's a belief. That's a faith-based belief. And what I'm going to show today is that that doesn't hold up to rigorous examination. It does not hold up. It is the politically correct position. It is the officially endorsed state position. But actually, the people I'm going to be talking about, the group of scientists that address this question, are called population geneticists. And they will acknowledge that it's very problematic to defend the mutation selection process as the source of all things, all life. And the fourth miracle, naturalistic miracle, is that once you have life, it's going to give rise to human beings who can do calculus, who can write beautiful music, who can send men to the moon and back, who have a soul. There's some type of mutations that give rise to a soul or a mind. And what you realize, if you just think about it carefully, that also is a faith-based position. No one's ever seen a mutation that creates a soul or creates a mind. And no one's ever been able to figure out how that even could conceivably happen, apart from a lot of hand-waving. So those are the four naturalistic miracles, and today we're going to look at this third one. It's really something we can take down. In fact, they're all very vulnerable. But spontaneous life is the cleanest one. It's just a slam dunk for us. And then spontaneous ascent, based upon the field of population genetics, is also a slam dunk. So in biology, there's so much to explain. If you study biology, you'd be bewildered by the complexity of it. A simple cell is more complex than New York City in terms of its transportation systems, its energy systems, its information systems. And so information systems, I believe, is key because it's information that codes for all the nanomachines, that codes for all the other systems are encoded by information. And what's emerging, and a biologist, whether you're atheist or not, or a believer, or believe in little green men, whatever you believe, if you're a biologist, everyone's coming to the realization that life is programmed. In fact, every molecule in a cell is programmed. And that's really mind-blowing. What's going on in a single living cell is comparable to the internet. You have millions of components talking to each other. They're all using different types of language and different types of signaling. And so as we're learning more about life, what we're seeing is these systems cannot arise by random mutations and selective reproduction. So beyond just the complexity of a cell, we have tissues, organs, brains, minds, whole organisms, populations, and ecosystems. And what all biologists see when they look at these things is design. The atheistic biologists still teach teleological. They say this molecule it needs to do this because it wants to do this. They speak of it as if it's a designed, purposeful system made of purposeful components because, in fact, that's exactly the way it looks. And you can't teach biology any other way except using that frame of wording. So let me just quickly show you a fun little video. We're going to just look quickly at ATP synthase. And so I'm going to narrate this little video clip for you. Well, actually, I clicked on the wrong one. We're going to first look at, let me go back. I'm going to unplug the sound. Okay, so we're going to look at this nano machine. It's just above the atomic level. There's millions of them in every cell. Every living system needs this machine. It's a universal machine found in all of life. These are all different types of machines embedded in the plasma membrane or within the matrix of the cytoplasm. There's just a myriad. Like there's thousands of types of machines, but each machine is present in thousands of copies. So there are millions, perhaps billions of nanomachines in every cell. So we're going to be looking at, go into the mitochondria. We're going to go look at the mitochondrial membrane. These are individual atoms on the surface of the membrane. And that island over there is part of the machine. Okay, here's the machine. And so this is turning very slowly, but in reality, it's rotating at tens of thousands of rounds per minute. Okay, so this thing's spinning like crazy. It is a literal motor. And so the motor, what drives it is there's lots of proteins up there and none on the inside, very few. And the proton gradient brings protons in through here. They go here, and they actually cause the thing to turn. It's kind of like a little windmill, you could think of it. That gives the driving force is the proton gradient. Protons come through here, and then it turns a rotor or crankshaft, which opens up these proteins. Now here we have a phosphate group coming in and a smaller molecule here, and the ATD is converted to ATP. This is very important because ATP is the energy currency of the cell. This is what makes cells alive, is the ADP and ATP. ATP is made into ADP into ATP. It's energized through this motor. Then everything that's driven, all the energy-driven systems in the cell, are driven by these little golden units. And we're going to see that in the next video. So it's a very sophisticated machine. And it looks, for anyone would agree, it looks like a well-designed machine. Okay, now we're going to look at one more quick video clip. What I'm trying to do is impress upon you that what's going on in the cell is programmed on the highest level. Programming at a level that's very hard for us to absorb. Programming that exceeds human ability to program. So we're going to look at programmed cell death, which is kind of a strange thing to look at. I think I'll plug it in because this has kind of cool sound effects. Apoptosis means programmed cell death. Sometimes you have a diseased cell like this one over here, and it's bad because it's got cancer or it's got a virus, and so it needs to be destroyed. And so what we have, this is 5,000x magnification, and these are pink healthy cells. Here's the diseased cell, the green one. And what's going to happen is a killer T cell, a white blood cell, is going to appear by squeezing between the tiny spaces between the cells. Really amazing that white cells can do that. And he's picking up a signal from the sick cell, and he goes over here to talk to the sick cell. He's not going to destroy it. He's going to say, destroy your cell. So that's the signal he's going to give. Here's the membrane of the diseased cell, and these are receptor proteins on the membrane. And we're going to see over on the left, here comes the killer T cell. And he's not going to come down and kill. He's going to take some of his own proteins, and his proteins are going to talk to these guys' proteins. The pink one's going to talk to the green ones, and they're going to communicate. And what they're going to communicate is self-destruct. And the programmed cell is going to obey. Here's on the inside of the membrane. This is now the activated part of the green protein. and they start to interact with other molecules. What we're going to see is a signal cascade. Okay? Wonderfully complex, carefully orchestrated signaling from one step to another, to the next, to the next. And so now we have a caspase activation. Now that molecule is going to go talk to some other molecule. Okay, here he goes. He's got that little golden spot. That's the ATP, the energy unit we're talking about. And so there's a cascade. One activates another, and so the signal is getting stronger within the cell. And so now there's higher levels of order. This guy is fusing them and then breaking them apart and creating more. It's kind of like a chain of command. And so now we've focused back out. We had zoomed in to the atomic level and molecular level. Now we're looking back at more of the cellular level. And here's this signal. All the purple ones are coming in. And so this signal is moving across the cell. And now we're looking at the mitochondria of the cell. What's triggered is now a release of the cytochrome C. And so now the cytochrome C is going to interact with these guys. I don't even know the names of all these molecules. But what you can see is the signal is being multiplied, and it's moving down the chain of command. And pretty soon we have these things developing. Now, every one of these components, all these little bumps are atoms, but this whole thing would be a whole protein coded for by a gene. So all these different proteins are coded by different genes. Each gene is like a program. The program codes the protein. The protein itself, all these subunits, can be considered itself an algorithm. It has a sequence, it has data, it has a job, and it does its job. So now we have the actin fiber. These are the fibers that run through the cell and hold the cell together. And this little guy is able to destroy the actin fibers. And when the actin fibers start to fall apart, we'll zoom back up to the whole cell level. Here's our diseased green cell. And the whole cell is going to dissolve itself. Now, it was not destroyed by the T cell. It was told to destroy itself, and it is pre-programmed. All that complexity is pre-programmed so that a cell, when it's no longer needed within a body, it will self-destruct. It's really pretty impressive programming. And it's kind of goes counter to the idea of survival of the fittest. So here's how the world explains it. The paradigm that rules the university today says neo-Darwinian theory explains all that. It also explains us, explains our minds, explains love. Love is just an evolutionary reflex. It explains morality. Morality just helps us reproduce. And so they'd say that explains it all. In Darwin's day, that was a reasonable point of view because they didn't understand that within a cell is extensive programming and that there's information systems that are beyond our technology. It doesn't work anymore. So this is what I call the primary axiom. Mutation, random mutations in the information, let's say in the DNA, random typographical errors, give rise to new programs. I would like to suggest that not only can we falsify this, but it's one of the most exciting things I can imagine. If this paradigm is not true, it does not prove God. But it means the university needs to rethink its paradigm. When a paradigm fails, it means it's time to go back to the drawing board and reconsider reality. So the nature of, there's basically a debate going on. Are we a product of natural process, or are we a product of design? So the natural process is mutation selection. If that's wrong, that does support the design hypothesis, doesn't it? In fact, all this stuff looks really designed, doesn't it? And even biologists would say, yes, it looks designed, but it's an illusion. Okay, so what I'm going to do today is, based upon the nature of what information really is, based upon the nature of mutations, what they really are, and based upon selection, how it really works, and those are my areas of expertise, I'm going to say that IT systems can only arise by intelligence. This is an engineering school. Are there any IT people here? Raise your hand. Okay, surprisingly few. How many of you think that a computer can arise spontaneously, or their program can write itself by random changes in zeros and ones? It's inconceivable. But that's what we're being told to believe in the biological level. Now IT systems need intelligence to arise. If you take away intelligence, IT systems break down. Your laptop is going to be junk in a few years. And the programs, if you just keep replicating programs, they will degenerate over time. Every aspect of IT breaks down, except the true information, which can be sustained by transmission from one mind to another. Lastly, selection happens, but it's basically conservative. Okay, selection happens, but it's not the creative force underlying life. It's what makes life last longer. That's what's going on there. Okay, so let's just review it, because we're talking about taking down the most important paradigm in the university. Let's make sure we understand what the paradigm is. The DNA in the cell is like an instruction manual. It instructs the cell how to be a human cell. Our DNA is programmed to make us human. And mutations are simply typographical errors. They're word processing errors. That's truly what they are, exactly what they are. So we have a book, which is the genome, or actually more accurately, it's an operating system. It's a complex set of programs. We have random errors in the program. Zeros and ones are being changed randomly. And then we're letting some of the modified programs be copied into the next generation, and others are not. That is the neo-Darwinian theory. Okay, now, is the primary axiom obviously true? Well, there's some aspects of it are obvious. Firstly, beneficial mutations happen. They're exceedingly rare, as just like a typographical error that improves a code. It's not inconceivable. It's just extraordinarily rare. Secondly, selection happens. We can easily, one of my jobs at Cornell was I was a fruit breeder, and I bred better fruit varieties through selection. I can do selection. I know how selection happens. It happens all the time in nature. And we know that things change over time. A lot of people said, well, that proves primary axiom, but that's so wrong. So here's one way to frame how to think about this, is in terms of information, biological information. In Darwin's day, they didn't have the concept of biological information. They had no idea that there were programs or books, language inside the cell. They had no idea. And so his notion of what was going on, how natural selection was happening, was kind of like a claymation movie, you know. Just things can morph, everything's flexible, so you just squeeze it and turn it, and you can change it from one thing into another. But what we now know is that life is programmed, so if you want to change life, you have to change the program. So since his day, when there was no knowledge of bioinformation, our knowledge of how much information is in the cell has increased continuously, with a huge jump, of course, occurring when we discovered DNA. That suddenly we realized, whoa, there's a lot of information in life. In fact, it looks superior to our computer technology. But then in the last 10 years, our understanding of biological information has exploded. I mean, really, really exploded. And so even as the amount of biological information that needs to be explained is increasing exponentially now, the Darwinian mechanism, which seems sufficient from Darwin's naive understanding of what biology is, and which was built, scientists throughout the world were building a case for the Darwinian mechanism. But things turned sour when they discovered DNA. And ever since then, the explanatory power of Darwin's mechanism has been declining. So you have biological information exploding, explanatory power of Darwin collapsing, and you have an unsustainable paradigm. The paradigm is going to change. You know, people can dig in their heels and maybe make it last another 10 years or another generation. But the paradigm is fundamentally failed. And so it's just a matter of time until people realize that. So I'm just going to take you through a very quick history of population genetics and Darwinian theory. And just so you can see the rise of it, how it arose, and then why it's collapsing. So we're going to start, of course, with Charles Darwin. And he envisioned a claymation view of evolution. Everything's flexible, and you just keep so things can just morph like an animated cartoon. He did not know there was information in a cell. He didn't even have the concept of biological information. So he could not understand that, like, what makes us human is our programming. Extensive amount of information programming us to be humans. If you want us to change into something like a whale, you need to completely reprogram it. It's not a few mutation changes. It's not a few letter changes. You have to radically change the programming. And programs don't arise by trial and error. So he ushered in Darwinian theory, but it was based upon a fundamental misunderstanding about the nature of life. The next person, just at the same time as Darwin was publishing, just a few years later, Mendel published his work on genetics. And he showed that traits within cells, within life, are passed on like packages of information, genes. And his research was ignored by the scientific community for one whole generation. A whole generation, while they were exalting Darwin, they were ignoring Mendel. And you might think that's strange because those of you who have a biology background have been told over and over that Darwin and Mendel fit together like a hand and a glove. That's not the way they saw it. Actually, Mendel's paper was found on Darwin's desk after Darwin's death. But they say, oh, his papers were lost. His publication was lost, but it wasn't. It was in all the libraries of Europe. It was ignored. It was suppressed. People wouldn't talk about it. Darwin didn't acknowledge it. Why? Because Mendel realized that information was in those packets. Once you realize that you have a certain number of information packets within a population, he was studying peas, big tall ones, short ones, green ones, yellow ones. If you select away the yellow ones and the short ones, they'll all be tall and green. You're done, okay? You get selection as long as you have information in the system. Once you've selected away the information you don't want, you can't make any more selective advance. So Mendel's understanding of genetics meant that Darwinian selection could be fine-tuning, but not transformation of one organism into another. The third person, a generation later, De Vries discovered there were spontaneous mutations, which was kind of the salvation. It seemed at first to be the salvation of Darwinian theory. In fact, in his era, scientists were saying Mendelism has killed Darwinism. And it makes sense in terms of what I've explained. But he said, no, there's spontaneous new variants. New genes pop up in a population. And that's going to fuel ongoing, as long as you have new mutations flowing into the population, you can have continuous advance. And this was essential to rescuing Darwinian theory. And it was formalized by people like Fisher, who was a mathematician in the 1930s. Another generation has passed. And he and others formulated neo-Darwinian theory. And he said, there's all these genes in the cell, in the population, and there's mutations coming in, and the mutations will give rise. Formally, he did what's called Fisher's theorem of natural selection, which was supposedly a mathematical proof of evolution. And the problem is, now we can falsify his theorem. He assumed that there were just as many good mutations as bad. And so his math was right if that was true. But we know that, like typographical errors, mutations are overwhelmingly bad and rarely good. And the bad ones can be lethal or very impactful. The good ones tend to be very slight improvements. So actually, now I have a colleague who's working with me. we're about to publish a paper that falsifies this theorem. But we already know just conceptually that he's wrong. He didn't understand the true nature of mutation. And so the whole neo-Darwinian theory was based upon numerous false premises. So here's 4 more important players in the rise of neo-Darwinian theory. But interestingly, each one of them introduced a problem. They said, wait, we're super advocated, super committed to the neo-Darwinian mechanism. We believe in it with all our hearts. But we are concerned with major problems for the theory. And what's disturbing to me is that these problems have been growing since the 1950s. These problems have been amplified, and they've been being put under the rug, sliding under the rug. And that's just not the way the academic world is supposed to operate. So Mueller is the first one. Let's look at Mueller. And he introduced the first problem, which is what I call genetic entropy or genetic degeneration. Okay, and these are the papers, key papers since the 50s of major population geneticists who have declared there's a major problem with neo-Darwinian theory. So Mueller was the first. He was a Nobel laureate. He discovered that radiation causes mutation, and that mutations are a health hazard. They're both generally very bad. And so Mueller is going to declare a major problem. Then in the 90s, Crow came out and said there's a huge problem. Kondrashov wrote a paper called Why Aren't We Dead 100 Times Over? Isn't that an interesting scientific paper title? Why aren't we dead 100 times over? Because he could not understand why genomes shouldn't degenerate instead of improve. Lynch, in the 2000s, wrote a series of papers showing that mutation accumulation leads to extinction of species, and is a major contributor to why species go over the edge. Kitely, Lowe, and Lynch have powerful statements saying, we don't understand how we can stop genetic degeneration. And then in the last 10 years, I've published over 10 papers on this. So one of the things I want you to understand, I'm not the first one to realize there was a problem, but I believe I've looked at the problem of genetic degeneration more than any of these people. I spent the last 10 years looking at it, just that. And all of these people are highly committed evolutionists, but they acknowledge the problem, kind of between the lines and subtly. They acknowledge the problem. I'm proclaiming the problem, and I'm saying we've known it since the 50s. So here's Mueller, Nobel laureate. Here's his paper from 1950, and I'm just going to read the red parts so we can move fast. He says a mutation rate above 0.5. That means if you have 0.5 more mutations than your parents, so it's a very low mutation rate, less than 1 mutation per generation. Mutation rate above 0.5 would result in genetic composition would deteriorate continuously, while the population would meanwhile diminish in numbers all the way to the point of disappearance. He's saying that a high mutation rate is lethal to a population. And he's specifically saying if the mutation rate is higher than 0.5, the human race must degenerate. And he was very, very concerned because they were doing atomic testing and there was more radiation, and they knew that was contributing to mutation. He realized that we could easily put us over the threshold of 0.5 and cause the human race to go extinct. And so he was very, very concerned about that. Well, what is the human mutation rate? Well, everybody acknowledges it's way above 0.5. It's about 60 or 100 or 200. I think it's about 100. The lowest reasonable estimates are 60 more mutations in the progeny than the parents. So, you know, this is a big problem. Just the mutation rate is a big problem. Just to get a sense of this Nobel laureate's mindset and how he's a strong eugenicist and a communist, he says it would, in the end, be far easier and more sensible to manufacture a complete man de novo out of appropriately chosen raw materials than to try to fashion into human form those pitiful relics which remain. That's us, really pitiful relics in him. And if then we eliminate 20%, if 20% failed involuntarily, 20% mortality before reproductive age, the remaining 80%, although they had contrived to reproduce, would on the whole be different, would be, on the whole, different from the doomed filth, but slightly. It would only be different from the doomed filth. So this is a eugenicist view of human degeneration, and it's pretty disturbing, actually. This is a technical point. I'll keep going. Neil, a nationally renowned geneticist, says this. He says he measured the mutation. He was one of the first ones to measure human mutation rates. Gametic rates for point mutations are on the order of 30 per generation. That means 30 from mom and 30 from dad. About minimally 60 mutations per generation was his estimate. The question of how our species accommodates such mutation rates is central to evolutionary thought. It's coming from a leading evolutionist in the field. Okay, let's look at Michael Lynch. He's one of the most esteemed population geneticists alive today. He concludes that for genetic reasons alone, sexual populations with effective population sizes smaller than 100 are unlikely to persist for more than a few hundred generations. A few hundred generations for a mammal species to survive genetic load once it's endangered. And so this is Alex Kondrashov. He's at Michigan University. He concludes the high load. He's talking about, this is the paper called Why Aren't We Dead 100? Why haven't we died 100 times over? And he concludes these subtle mutations, very subtle bad mutations, like rust on a car, they act like a time bomb. The existence of vertebrate lineages should be limited to, and he gives a large number, generations. But he's saying that the species should be going down and that they should be headed toward extinction. That's his analysis. I think it's actually overgenerous, but I'm going to try to keep moving. Here's an esteemed population geneticist. All these guys are evolutionists. He says we should increase our attention to the broader question of how or whether organisms can tolerate, in the sense of evolution, a genetic system with such a high mutation burden. He's talking about just the mutations in man within the mitochondria, which is 1/1,000,000th of the total genome. Just the mutations in one tiny part of our genome should cause us to go extinct. And James Crow, recently deceased, one of the top geneticists of the last century, he says mutations have been accumulating for the last few centuries, and it's something like a time bomb, but with a much longer fuse. And he's saying our fitness is going down, if you look at the end of this line, 1 to 2% per generation. That's a really fast rate of degeneration. I'm just going to try to keep fast forwarding here. Walker and Kitely, just quoting from their paper. These are all leading population geneticists. Okay. Hi, Alex. Nicole. Deleterious mutation rates appear to be so high in humans and our close relatives that it is doubtful that such species could survive. These are evolutionists who are saying the mutation rates we have are unsustainable. Species have to go extinct with these mutation rates. Okay, Nachman and Kroll. He's saying the genetic load associated with such high mutation rate would be intolerable. Each female would need to produce 40 offspring for just 2 to survive. So most families aren't that big, so you have a problem. Again, coming back to, I'm going to skip, I'm going to keep going forward. Lawrence Lowe says a surprisingly large range of biologically realistic parameters should lead to extinction of the evolutionary line leading to humans within 20 million years. He's saying we shouldn't have evolved. We should have gone extinct before we evolved from lower organisms. He's a leading evolutionist. And so this is the last one, Michael Lynch. He was recently elected to the National Academy of Science. His inaugural paper involved human mutation rates and what they mean. And he said in the next few centuries, 1 to 5%, there will be 1 to 5% fitness decline per generation. Try to imagine 5%. If your bank account was shrinking 5% per year, would you be concerned? He concludes there will be significant incapacitation at the morphological, physiological, and neurobiological levels. Okay, that's the problem of genetic degeneration. Now, I didn't even mention my own work. But just when you look at, these are the who's who of population geneticists, right? And they're all agreeing we have a big problem here. We can't explain why species don't just mutate themselves to death. And so that's, how many of you heard that before? If this is yeah. How many of your professors know about this problem? See, this is well known within the population genetics field. If you're anywhere, if you're at all informed about population genetics, you should know about this. But how many professors here are aware of it? It's been swept under the rug. It's like, well, we know it's true. You can read it in our papers, but we don't talk about it because it's really a huge problem for neo-Darwinian theory. The second problem is the creative problem. Not only can we not preserve genomes, they must degenerate. Just like buying a new car, you know it's going to depreciate. You can't really create the genome or even a gene through the mutation selection process. The creative aspect of this is incredibly limited in terms of what it can do. And so this is, again, I'm not going to go through this list like I did with the other one, but since the 50s, top population geneticists have been saying, really, it's hard to defend the idea that, that natural selection can do all this. And so the most famous name up here is Haldane, who in the 50s, after the discovery of DNA, said, we have a problem because the best we could do is fix 1,000 good mutations, if that many arose, due to the slow process of selective fixation. That is, when a mutation goes from being just one copy in the population, everybody in the population has 2 copies. That takes deep time, and you can only do it for a few mutations at a time. It's called selection interference. Anyway, he announced there's a big problem here. It became called Haldane's dilemma, and it is still, in fact, it's been validated by several other scientists, including Chris Roop, who's up. Chris Roop and I have just published a paper on that. So Haldane's dilemma is very real. Kimura is a very famous name. He developed the neutral theory of evolution. Do you know why he did it? Well, actually, I'm going to try to show you that one. Here's Haldane. Here's Kimura. And we're just going to look at his quote. Kimura agreed with Haldane's calculations. And he said, Haldane's well-known estimate, a new allele may be substituted in a population every 300 generations at best. And he said, and at the rate of substitution every 2 years, only one fixation every 2 years. That's really, really slow to transform, let's say, a monkey into a man. The substitutional load becomes so large that no mammal species could tolerate it. You can't even get 2 substitutions every 2 years, 1 substitution every 2 years, because of the limits of selective fixation for beneficials. He calculated that compared to Haldane's formula, actually he's saying Haldane was too conservative. The problem is worse than Haldane said it. And he finally concludes that each parent would have to leave 3 million offspring to survive and reproduce, to explain all the selection that the other population geneticists imagined might be happening. So he was saying selection can't explain all the change we see. So it must not have happened by selection. It must have happened by random drift, neutral drift. So neutral theory is an acknowledgement of the limits of natural selection. People think it's very sophisticated because it's very mathematical, but it's really just saying, hey, natural selection can't do what you think it's doing. You can only get a few beneficials fixed in deep evolutionary time. So let me see how we're doing with time. Okay, about time to wrap up. So let me just quote from Hoyle. He was a leading scientist and physicist. He actually gave the name Big Bang to the Big Bang. And here's what his quote says. He wrote a book called Mathematics of Evolution. And in his book, he's a hardcore evolutionist. He says, but he doesn't believe the Darwinian mechanism. So we're going to I'll explain a little more about that. The aging process shows, indeed, that statements that one frequently hears to the effect that the Darwinian theory is as obvious as the Earth going around the sun are either expressions of almost incredible naivete. See, that's the point I want you to understand. Is those of you who think that it's obvious that natural selection can even stop degeneration, he's saying is incredibly naive. You haven't studied population genetics if you believe that. And not only are they naive, or they are deceptions. They're lying to you, he's saying. He's not a creationist, he's not a Christian. He denies God. So with such widespread evidence of senescence in the world around us, it still seems amazing that so many people think it obvious that the biological system as a whole should be headed in the opposite direction. And so he goes on to say, there is slow genetic erosion, however, which natural selection cannot prevent. That's my work for the last 10 years. Okay? And he's agreeing with me, or I'm agreeing with him because he came first. This long-term inability of natural selection to preserve the integrity of genetic material sets a limit on a DNA sequence. Every DNA sequence can only degenerate, and it's eventually going to go extinct. So how does he explain life? He doesn't believe in God, and he doesn't believe in natural selection. What's his answer? Little green man. Aliens. See, he's acknowledging the need for design, but he doesn't want to acknowledge God. So numerous famous scientists, Francis Crick, the primary discoverer of DNA, after studying the origin of life and realizing it could never have happened spontaneously, guess what his answer was? Little green men did it. Even Richard Dawkins in a recent interview said, you know, it's an interesting thing. Of course, God couldn't have done it, but maybe little green men could have come here and planted life. So who created the little green men? But anyway, the point is that there are people who have studied neo-Darwinian theory critically, like he did, come to the conclusion, this is bogus. This doesn't work. We've been deceived. So major new developments that have been occurring in the last decade that are devastating to neo-Darwinian theory. Well, one of them is my book, which I have a copy of here. Basically, it's just, I took several years of my life to ask the question, does it work? And after like 5 years of study, I had enough for a book to show, no, it doesn't work. Genomes should degenerate. They should not get better. And in addition to that, there's huge developments. During the last 10 years, the paradigm of junk DNA collapsed. Do you know why they developed junk DNA? The concept? It's because they said all these mutations would be lethal, and they would lead to extinction, so they must mostly be neutral. If they were all deleterious, everything would go down quickly, so they invented the idea of junk DNA. But junk DNA has now collapsed. That makes defending neo-Darwinian theory vastly more difficult. Vastly more difficult. The human chimp genome, how many of you were taught that there's a 98% similarity between the human and chimp genome? Okay, you were deceived. It's about 70%. Profoundly different genomes. There's growing evidence, like the Lynch paper I mentioned, that the human population is going down, not up. It's very clear theoretically that bad mutations, most of them are very subtle, and only the worst ones get selected away. All the rest accumulate like rust on a car. And furthermore, beneficial mutations are unbelievably rare, and the discovery of overlapping codes, think of computer codes that can be read two different ways and have both work independently. That's what's going on in the genome. That makes beneficials even about 1,000-fold more rare than we thought. Beneficial mutations that do happen generally are not selectable because they're too subtle, and Mother Nature can't see them. And lastly, what we're learning about the nature of biological information is that it's irreducible, because you need hardware, you need software, you need power, you need operating systems, and you need algorithms, and you need sending molecules and receiving molecules for all the information. And so the evidence in the last 10 years would make any honest person who looked at this reject neo-Darwinian theory. But people have committed their lives, their reputations, and their whole careers to defending this. Population genetics was developed as a field to defend Darwinian theory. And so the population geneticists are not eager to say our field is just imploded. So one of the most significant developments, I believe, and I'm biased, is this new book. And it's called Biological Information, New Perspectives. It's the proceedings from a symposium at Cornell University. I participated and helped organize it. 29 scientists, high caliber, well-credentialed scientists from information theory, computer science, from molecular biology, genetics, biophysics, every field you could imagine. 29 scientists, they all concluded we can be sure of one thing, and that is that biological information and information systems, IT systems within the cell, cannot arise by random spelling errors and differential reproduction on the whole organism. So this book should be in the RIT library. I would ask somebody in this room who's associated with RIT to just request the library to order it. It's called Biological Information, New Perspectives, and I can give you the information of how it can be ordered. But this should be in every library because it addresses the whole issue. It's basically the death knell of neo-Darwinian theory, which is about the most significant intellectual development that could happen in our lifetime. So is the primary axiom obviously true? It's not obviously true to anyone who knows anything about population genetics. It is believed, most of the true believers have not critically examined the evidence, and they believe it by faith. And so other scientists and the general public don't know there's an issue. They don't know that there's a whole series of huge theoretical problems with the conventional view of explaining all of life in terms of misspellings and differential reproduction. So why haven't you heard? Why haven't your professors heard? It's because evidence is being suppressed. And the Bible says in the first chapter of Romans that the wrath of God is being revealed because of the wickedness of men who suppress the truth in unrighteousness. The truth is being suppressed, and as a consequence, many people lose their faith, and many souls are being lost. This is one of the most powerful forces of atheism, and one of the most powerful forces that stands against Christian faith. And so it's good news for believers to see that the paradigm's coming down. I just pray that people in the field are honest enough at some point to say, we need to acknowledge publicly that we have huge problems in our theory. So that takes down one of the 4 pillars of atheism. You can't be an atheist unless all 4 pillars stand. You have to have all of these systems being able to happen spontaneously without design to be an atheist. And that one just came down, and if you look carefully, the spontaneous life has already come down, and the 2 end ones are coming down. So that's good news for believers. For skeptics, it's something to think about. Because I trust that we're all seeking truth. That's thanks for your patience, and I'm open to questions. Thanks. Probably too technical for most of the people here, but for the people who are biologists, I hope it resonated. I hope it resonated for the computer scientists here, because you know how hard it is to make IT systems work.
So what's the practicalness of taking down naturalist theory? I mean, when it comes to doing research, all scientists are out there right now using the scientific method, which I think everyone pretty much, as a scientist, can agree they use the same method, just looking at the evidence differently. If you're bringing down a paradigm, how does that change the field academically and what people are investigating?
Okay. So, so when a paradigm is in trouble, there are some people who have invested heavily. One of the first things you have to understand is there's no such thing as an objective scientist. I've been a scientist all my life. I've never met an objective scientist. We are all passionate about our view of truth. We're all seeking truth. Well, we all seek truth for a while, and then we lock into one, and then we defend it with all our might, no matter what the evidence shows. That's bias. That's why in medicine, we have blind blind experiments, double-blind experiments, because we acknowledge, hey, I really want my new pharmaceutical to work, and you better blindfold me because I just won't be able to be objective here. So we do need, everybody has to acknowledge their own bias. If you don't do that, you're not a scientist. So that's the first thing. Second thing is, when a paradigm's coming down, it's not a time for, oh no, we have to fix it. It's a time of intellectual excitement. Because if that's not the reality, what is? And so everybody should be, it should be like an explosion in terms of people's thinking, because suddenly they realize they can explore other models. And that it's not wicked or stupid to explore other models. It's the only reasonable thing to do when a paradigm is coming down. Now, lastly, when a paradigm is coming down that's been deeply entrenched and has philosophical, religious, and moral implications, then that's very significant, because when you falsify a thesis, you support the antithesis, or more accurately, when you falsify the antithesis of design, that there is a God or there's some purpose in life and we are made for a reason, that is the traditional view. Design is the default view of everyone who looks at biology. The people who don't want God have forced on us an alternative view, which is there's no God. The appearance of design comes from natural process. If that thought is false, then it strongly supports God and design. In fact, it's irrational at that point to deny God. You might say, well, maybe someday we'll discover some other natural mechanism that might give rise to life and the ascent of life. But until then, you're just going on faith, just as much as if you were believing, actually more so, because the evidence says things are designed. That's the default position. Any honest person who didn't have a preconceived notion, when they look at the nanomachines in a cell and the information systems in a cell, will go, wow, I'd love to meet the team of engineers who put that little molecule together. So it's very exciting, and what's strange is the room is empty. The room is pretty much empty. This is the most exciting thing that could be happening. Most of the world does not want to hear it. They just say, I can't hear you. And it's really disturbing, because I've been sitting on this for years now, knowing that the paradigm's wrong, and just waiting for other people in the field to just get honest. And what they've done is they've ignored the problems and ignored publications that they don't want to hear. Yes?
I found this speech very fascinating because before I heard this speech, I always observed if Darwinism is true or not true, because there's always some evidence support this, other evidence support that, the other side. But right now, I think it's very clear for me to pick one side, because I can understand why it must be wrong. I like the word you use, the entropy, because it's very close to physics system. It always, the entropy always going up without, some other to interfere with it.
Right.
So, yeah, the natural must degenerate the gene instead of doing like new information or new species coming up. So the question right now is, where this new energy or this new information comes from? What is the source?
Right.
Because without that source,
Right.
it just naturally degenerates itself.
That is correct. It's not energy that's lacking, it's intelligence, because information comes from, anybody who works with IT knows that information systems come through intelligence. And so without intelligence, everything degenerates universally. Now, the Darwinists would say everything degenerates without intelligence except when natural selection is operating. Natural selection is a very crude instrument. It's like trying to fix a computer with a hammer. It's inappropriate. It's a tool that's useful for some things. It is not a creative tool. It's not how you create computers or information systems. So entropy does hold. It's universal. And the only antiforce to entropy is intelligence. If you consider your own life, your own car, your own house, it's all decaying. And even with your best efforts, you can only slow the degeneration. And that's true in biology. Everything's decaying in biology. My cell, I have 3 mutations per cell division. Everyone here Every time you have a cell division in your body, 3 more mutations. I carried 40,000 more mutations than when I was conceived, and I inherited thousands of mutations from my parents. So I am totally, the reason I'm getting old and gray and need glasses and all that is because I'm undergoing mutational degeneration. And selection among my progeny might be able to slow that down, but every generation must always be more mutant than their parents, with high certainty.
I agree with that. So the question is, does that mean actually when the human species was first created, that we always degenerated afterwards, like ever since?
Right. So that is the biblical view. If you study the Bible, you will discover that's what people, that's what God was saying when he wrote the Bible. That's the history of early man. If you look at the descendants of Noah and their lifespans, it shows their lifespan declining in an exponential decay curve. It's very striking. And the message of the scripture is we are dying people in a dying world, and our only hope is heaven. That's the Christian worldview. Once you understand that you're dying because of mutations, and there's no miracle cure. Lynch himself, a hardcore atheist, said there's nothing we can do about the mutation problem because it's so fundamental. Every cell mutates every time it divides. There's nothing, no magic drug that's going to stop us. So we are dying people without a doubt.
So that means we are not evolving. So that means our human man is not superior than the ancient human beings. Actually, we are worse.
So that's what Crow said. Crow is the most famous geneticist of the last century. He said we are inferior to cavemen. So why don't we feel inferior? Take away my glasses. Right out there. Take away the braces I had as a kid. Take away modern medicine. Take away the nutrition I have. Take away vaccines. Take away antibodies. And our life expectancy would be more like 40. So yeah, we feel like we're getting better because of biomedical intervention, because of technology. But actually, we are inferior to our parents, who are inferior to their parents. And so what it points to, which is like mind-blowing for me as a scientist, is it points to a creation point. Not billions of years ago, but a creation point much more recent. And that we were made, that Adam and Eve were, we would worship them. They would be, well, Adam lived to be 900 years old. Poor guy, he died of old age at that point. But before the fall, he would have lived forever because God was sustaining. Not only God makes us, but before the fall, before sin entered the world, he sustained us. In heaven, he will not only give us a new and incorruptible body, but he will sustain it so that we're not subject to mutation.
So the way I'm seeing this problem is, I can see 2 different ways to keep the whole life going on, because obviously without some outer force, all the life will be distinct eventually. So the only 2 ways I can think of is, first is there is a continuous force interfere with our lives to keep generating those new informations, pumping up, so prevent our degeneration. The other way is it's only pump up once in a while. And it sounds like it's the second way, because if it's a continuous pumping up, then we shouldn't expecting a real degeneration because it will be cancelled by pumping up.
Right.
But since we can sense, we can observe that degeneration, which means it has to be pumping up once, only once in a while.
Right.
And what I can think of is very similar to explosion.
Like the Cambrian explosion. So you've just described 2 important theological positions. The first one is theistic evolution, and the second one would be old Earth creation. So you're very quickly going from what's clearly obvious scientifically and making theological conclusions, which means your brain is functioning properly. Yeah, until you get old like me. So yeah, you're adding 2 plus 2 together. Hallelujah.
Okay, so do we have a clue what is
Well, let's just consider our own life, our own body. We are conceived once. We're made with a certain amount of information. And then from then on, it's a degenerative process until we go to the grave. So it's a one-way trip. So one way to do it is to think of species as people. They begin, they're young, they're healthy, they're vigorous. Over time, they decay and they go extinct. That's my understanding. We've done experiments with, we've analyzed the genome of influenza, the H1N1, the strain that caused 1918 pandemic, killed almost 100 million people, died in 1918 due to when influenza came into the human population. We've tracked that, we have the genomes of that through time that were frozen. And we now know the sequence data. We can show that that strain continuously degenerated through mutation accumulation for the last 90 years and went extinct just in 2009, that strain. So we can trace genetic entropy in a real biological system because mutations have high, RNA viruses have high mutation rates. We can see it happening in real time. Yes? Yes, go ahead.
I read most of your paper on the influenza virus degenerating, and I actually had a question. It sounded like from your paper that the rate of degeneration in even flu viruses, it seemed like it was so rapid that they should be extinct after a couple hundred years. And from your position, from what I've read from you before, do you think the Earth is young, if I'm understanding correctly?
Yeah, so my view of the age of the Earth is faith-based. So this research is based upon what I've learned scientifically. But I have, all of us, one of the things we all have to understand is we understand some things by faith, things we choose, based upon largely who we decide to trust as our source of information. And we all are based on what we believe based upon evidence and experience. So what I tried today to do is describe evidence and things I've learned through research. And then in our question and answer period, I do express my philosophical and religious perspective. But I always want us to keep in mind that there's a tension there. Like even the skeptics in the room hold some things by faith and some things by true understanding. Very important for us to be intellectually honest, to discern what things we believe by faith and what things we believe by evidence. But coming back to the RNA virus, the question of why RNA viruses aren't all extinct, I think has to do with natural reservoirs. And that can actually be seen in the virus. The study we did is H1N1, the strain we're talking about, went extinct in about 1950, in the 50s. And then would have been the end of it. But some researcher had a frozen sample in his lab, and it escaped the lab. And so 20 years, it was extinct for 20 years, essentially. But it reemerged from a reservoir, in this case, a researcher's freezer, and repopulated, started to infect the human population again. And it picked up right where it left off in terms of mutation accumulation. So it's a really fascinating example of a kind of a near extinction event or a temporal extinction. And then it may come back again because there may be frozen samples of it. 1,000 years from now, it could come back out of a freezer or out of a glacier or out of a desiccated sample somewhere. So yeah, these viruses don't have to be continuously dividing through time. Viruses and bacteria are usually in a quiescent state most of the time. Yes?
Yeah, so if all of these life forms are degenerating through each generation, why don't we see some effects of this in like a species like mayflies, which have generations in very short time frames?
So that's a good question. It has to do with mutation rate. So basically, everything at a nucleotide level per replication has about the same mutation rate. So everything should be degenerating about the same time. But because some organisms have tiny genomes, the actual mutation rate per genome per generation is very low. So things like fruit flies have a mutation rate that is something like 100-fold less than human. So even though they have lots of generations, they have very few mutations per generation. Bacteria, for example, have a very low mutation rate. You have to have about 1,000 divisions before you see your first mutation. And so, so the reason we still have these microbial systems is they're often quiescent, not dividing, and they have very low mutation rates per cycle. Yes?
So basically, I'm an IT guy, and so I got asked this by someone when I was arguing against evolution. So they were talking about the peppered moths, changing their color after the industrial revolution, and some of the female species mimicking another species. So
We see we can acknowledge natural selection happens. We don't even have to say that all mutations are deleterious. But natural selection is very limited. And in this case, peppered moth is a great example. It was initially a peppered moth population with mostly light and some dark. And then there was a period where they became mostly dark and then light. And they thought it was due to coal pollution, industrial melanism. But actually, that's not clear. It may have been simply genetic drift, because it turns out that peppered moth don't land on the trunk of trees, which are often discolored by coal. They land on the underside of leaves. And so the color is probably a drift phenomenon rather than a selection phenomenon. But certainly selection does happen. When selection happens, it's usually for just favoring one gene, one mutation, it's like fine-tuning of a program. You could imagine a computer program where most changes in the code would be deleterious. One that just changed the code a tiny bit might be a refinement, and under certain conditions would be favorable. And you could say, oh, good, a random change in my code resulted in improvement. It's conceivable. In biology, it happens. So we call it adaptation. We don't call it evolution. We say when you're doing fine-tuning an organism to its environment, you're not creating new information, you're not creating a new organism, you're just fine-tuning it so it has a slight advantage. And it's a way of sustaining the population rather than creating a new and different species. It's a way of keeping the species the same, really, because it doesn't go extinct or need to radically transform. Yep. In the back?
You'll have to say so if you can't hear me, but my question actually starts with one thing that I want to understand is that your model states that the source of our degradation is the continual random mutations that we get from cell division, right?
Yes, although you can have mutations even in tissues like the brain where there's no cell division going on.
So how do you, okay, that brings up another question about how the damage gets there, because what I'm wondering is how your model would address things such as epigenetics and the fact that we live in a very dynamic, degrading environment where I believe you're saying that we keep acquiring mutations and we keep acquiring, and at some points it's even greater. And having studied epigenetics and seeing how we handle and manage the world around us, I'm wondering, learning that other things in our environment outside of DNA replication can affect mutations. I see that we increase our pollution greatly, we mismanage waste, we pollute the air we breathe, we pollute water. The metabolism that we gorge ourselves in excess of food creates harmful byproducts continuously, and we only increase that more and more. We weaken our immune systems more and more and affect generations after us by the drugs we take. And I'm wondering, with that perpetual environment, how does your model respond? Where we keep making a worse and worse environment that continually harms us and causes mutations, that causes alterations in DNA, that causes alterations in the expression of our genetic code beyond the DNA level. And with that dynamic perpetually degrading environment against us, I believe your model assumes that our environment is constant in a way and that our mutation rate is not affected by that.
Okay, so I think I can break it down into three questions. The first is epigenetics. It's really fascinating. What we see in life is layer upon layer of information. So epigenetics represents just one more layer of information that needs to be explained. And it looks like a very sophisticated system, information system. So again, it's just another layer that mutation selection can't explain. So epigenetics really supports my thesis. A variable environment messes up selection because you're being jerked this way with selections jerking you this way and then jerking you that way. So a variable environment makes selection worse and makes degeneration worse. Environmental contamination or more mutagens and stress also make the genetic entropy problem worse. But even if we lived in a perfect, ecologically perfect environment, there's a basal mutation rate, which has to do with just the efficiency of DNA replication. And so even if we were to solve all our environmental problems, we would still be mutating about the same rate because DNA replication is imperfect. So I totally agree. We should be avoiding mutagens the best we can because it accelerates aging and we pass our mutations on to our children. So we definitely want to minimize mutagens. But I want you to understand that epigenetics is just another level of information that makes Darwinian theory impotent. Darwinian theory can't explain how epigenetics could have ever arisen. It's a whole other IT system above and beyond genetics. And so it should awe all biologists when they look at life. They should, instead of being, oh, we've got it all figured out, they should go, what we're seeing is awesome beyond our understanding. So yes, let me just make a plug before we go, and then we'll come to your question. Nicole Alex came back, and I wanted to share with you here something called Ratio Christi. Ratio Christi is a new campus organization focused entirely on defending the Christian faith in a hostile environment, which is the university. And it's a grassroots thing. It started 2 to 3 years ago when some students said, hey, we're getting beat up in class every day. Let's get together and at least, comfort each other. And the idea started to spread, and now it's become an official campus ministry. So there's 120 chapters in the United States. There's chapters in South Africa and other parts of the world. It's a really powerful thing. It's not instead of InterVarsity or basic or it is a service to them, because you see, all Christians have the same problem. Their faith is being attacked, and so it's basically so the club we have at Geneseo is we have people coming from InterVarsity and basic and all the other ministries. They come to our events because they're all looking to be encouraged. So Nicole and I started the chapter in Geneseo, and we want a chapter here. We want a chapter at U of R. We want a chapter at every campus. And we will help you organize a club if you want. And basically, the club shares speakers. So if someone comes to visit us and to speak on something that's apologetically related, they can come here and speak to you while they're in town. So it's really a cool development. If you're interested, talk to me or Nicole when they break up. Okay, your question.
Yeah. So I was thinking, because I'm not really too familiar with the bio stuff, but about the junk DNA, I'm thinking, so if I'm the designer for all the lives, what I will do is, because I know there will be degeneration and mutations, so what I will do is, in order to prevent like the mutation rate being too high, I will put like real junk DNAs, because in that way, like there will be a large portion of the mutation happening on those junk DNAs, so that doesn't affect the real DNA. So is that the real case when we have junk DNA, or if we can find any evidence of that, then is that a support that actually we are denying?
So it's a good point. The junk DNA paradigm has collapsed. So now what they used to call junk, we now know has function. So that's history now. But if you did have junk DNA, it just increases. The more DNA you have, the more mutations. So it doesn't draw away mutations from the good part of the DNA. It just mutates itself. Like if you had at the end of a book, if you threw in an extra chapter that was just letters, and you had some typographical copying problem, it doesn't help preserve the good part of the text to have junk text. But your point is, you're thinking like an engineer, which is good. If you have a problem with mutational degeneration, one of the things you'll do is create redundancy.
Yeah,
So,
that's what I'm saying.
yes. And so, you know, the space shuttle, I think, has, what, 4 or 5 computer systems that are totally redundant. So if 1 or 2 or even 3 fail, you still have something that works. Well, we are genetically redundant. We have 2 copies of everything, 1 copy for mom and 1 for dad. We each carry several hundred lethal mutations, but the reason we're not dead is we have a broken gene and a working gene. As long as one of them works, we're okay. If they're both broken, we're dead. So, so there's redundancy built into the genome, and massive redundancy. And it reflects design. Evolution can't anticipate problems before they happen. So only through design can you have things like DNA repair enzymes and redundancy of systems.
Yes, so the redundancy system actually is a kind of proof that supports the creationist.
Very strongly supportive. And let me just clarify the term creation. I think that the better word is design. There are people in this room who are who agree that life is designed and believe that either little green men or God did it. But within the design movement are old Earth creationists, young Earth creationists, and theistic evolutionists. So it's just useful to understand that evidence against Darwin doesn't prove one of those. It just proves that it strongly points to that design is real, and that there has to be a designer, either little green man or God. The rest of your theology has to come from other sources. I believe from the Bible. So I really, really appreciate this active discussion and your excellent questions. And I just, you know, I've been wrong about a lot of things in my life. And I think the case for this is very, very strong. And I just want you to understand, I didn't cite my own work. I cited the work of the evolutionists themselves. My own work goes beyond what they've done. If I come back, if you want me to come back, I'll give you an hour talk about genetic entropy and an hour talk about how mutation selection can't create genomes. But I think you should at least acknowledge, even if skeptics, friends, that there are major problems with neo-Darwinian theory and that they've been kind of swept under the rug. It's not right for people to think evolutionary is just totally a fact when the experts are acknowledging that there are major, major problems. That's just a minimal request that I ask of you, is that you acknowledge that. Thank you very much. God bless you.